Well, firstly, thank you to Jan and Jill and the team, Chris, for inviting me to speak here. So just a kind of bit of a sense of what I'm going to talk about in terms of context. So I've worked with Jim O'Neill for the last 5 years, very deeply as part of various ESRC and other research actions within the broader academy. And my work has been focused heavily on the productivity issue. And both Jan and Jill have been involved in other things I've been connected with. And so now I'm working with Vanya Senna, who's here, Professor Vanya Senna from the University of Sheffield. So we're really leading within the overall InterAct agenda. We're leading on the kind of economic landscape type of the future of the economy and where the manufacturing and the digitalization agenda fits within the broader challenges of the UK economy. And equally, how those challenges shape the agendas that we're talking about here. So it's a fantastic time to be working on these issues. And as an economist, it's a fantastic time because, of course, the engineering and the manufacturing specialists open up lots of questions that often economists don't think about. That's really important. But equally, I think economists can bring questions to the engineering and the technology of the manufacturing world that often specialists in those arenas also don't necessarily think about. So I think this kind of meeting of narratives and is extremely important. So just to kind of highlight the things that we might want to think about. One of the things that Vanya and myself are leading on at the moment is a kind of a position piece, a landscape. Where does the engineering, manufacturing, new technologies, digitalization, where does it fit in the overall discussions about where we are as an economy and where we're going? And there are many issues that start to arise when you think in that sense, that you see that a lot of what's happening in this world actually heavily shapes how we think about the wider economy. You know, often within economics particularly, you often hear people say, oh no, that's manufacturing. You know, we're thinking about services. But when you're working with engineers, these are very blurred distinctions between manufacturing and services. You know, a lot of IT-related programming work, is that manufacturing or services? You're working in a manufacturing firm, but you can have people on secondment from a programming company. And of course, engineers, in that sense, people who are making things, think differently, whereas economists often will tend to categorize things very quickly. And I think this is important to try and bridge those narratives. So to give you some examples. So of course, from the 1980s onwards, we had this big shift towards just-in-time, lean manufacturing. These are global phenomena, and of course the UK was heavily invested in driving forward a lot of these techniques and thinkings. But there's been shifts in the last 10 or 15 years, obviously many of you are in the vanguard of, much more towards resilience. Instead of just being very, very lean, it's also the ability to adapt to shocks. And of course today, my goodness, that's what we're all talking about. And that's a different way of thinking. The kind of lean manufacturing was very much focused in a world where demand was fairly stable and predictable. So you're optimizing all the time with respect to something. You've got a moving target, but the target is actually moving quite slowly and only within a fairly narrow range. Of course, today, that's not the world that many of us are working in, and particularly many of you are not working in that kind of context. And that's changed how you start asking questions right from the beginning. Supply chains, again, the lean system tended to have a fairly linear type of model within which you're optimizing, you know, fairly clean objectives, things fitting together in some sort of chain of actions and events. But of course, in the context that you're working in today, reconfiguration is much more important than optimization of a standard configuration that you all understand, because the second format is largely frayed and in some cases completely disappeared. And in terms of economics, that changes how you ask questions, because you can frame an economic argument with a fairly standard notion of what the demand and supply conditions are. But if those demand and supply conditions are themselves changing dramatically, you have to think rather differently how you might want to set up that kind of economic discussion. I mean, for example, there's a lot of, you know, in the kind of post-Brexit environment, also the kind of political shocks vis-a-vis China, some of the emerging countries. There's often people are talking about things like greater nearshoring. Instead of outsourcing, kind of much more in-house, bringing things back close to the source. And obviously things like new advances in digital manufacturing, 3D printing, and so on. There are elements there of the more craft-based ways of production, greater customization, flexibility, and that may encourage these kinds of discussions. There's been a lot of conversations around this, as you know. But at the same time, what we also know in terms of the resilience argument and the adaptability to shocks is that you actually need greater connectivity to more supply sources, more options. The ability to shift and to move and to reconfigure doesn't necessarily equate with the notion of nearshoring, unless that nearshoring is also opening up other options to adapt. And that's a tension that we're not quite clear about. You know, in a sense, near and bringing things close sounds rather safe and comfortable, but it may also be restrictive. And we don't know about that tension yet. These are things which are emerging. You know, in a sense, the jury is somewhat out on that issue, but there are elements that I'll kind of pick up on in a moment. So there is certainly evidence of some sort of consolidation, if you like, in things what we might think of as global regions. So when we talk about near and close, we may actually be talking about the whole of Europe, or the whole of North America, or the whole of, you know, Latin America. It's not necessarily my town or my county or whatever. So the notions of what we mean by near or close is something that, you know, there's different evidence from different sectors, but the idea of everything being outsourced or going global, as some people might have thought about these things, that there seems to be some sort of changes along those directions. And of course, that also requires the kind of multitasking, upskilling. We've heard a lot about that this morning. That's exactly the point. To be able to develop more sophisticated, flexible, and resilient systems, you also need a wider array of skills that better enhance the relationships between the workers and the technology they're adopting and the ability to change. So of course that gets us into a lot of the skills training and retraining issues that I don't need to comment on anymore, because obviously a lot of people have been talking about these things. But where do these things really tend to accelerate versus bite? A lot of evidence suggests it's the big companies versus everybody else. The larger companies are able to integrate newer technologies much quicker and therefore become much more adaptable. And the cost of developing and adapting and reskilling and upskilling for these new technologies tends to be borne much more severely by small and medium-sized companies. And that's a general pattern. So there are issues there. We think about how can we overcome that? How can we facilitate the dissemination of these practices? You know, for example, in the German Mittelstand case, many of you know there's a very strong role for chambers of commerce. They play an extraordinarily strong role in terms of training, linking businesses, looking at industry demands, providing courses for local skills, upskilling, and so on. They're things that we can think about. Also, of course, the work from home shock, we've already heard about that this morning, has changed how people think about their working practices. And that's just as true in manufacturing as it is in services, because manufacturing services are very, very blurred. Those overlaps are very complex, and these are things which are evolving and changing. So within the economics profession, a lot of people are having to start ask questions rather differently, because the context in which we frame economics arguments is also itself changing. A few points on the specifics of the UK economy. We've had some huge shocks, as we know. Obviously, Brexit was a very large shock in terms of the fundamental changes in our trade framework. You know, are we more or less integrated with our neighbours? What does that mean? Obviously, many of you are dealing with these things in your day-to-day work. COVID-19 was a huge shock. It's changed working practices in many, many industries, work from home, but also how people think about, you know, face-to-face interaction with suppliers and customers. That's all changed dramatically. And in a sense, you know, we don't know the full evolutions of those things yet. They're still too recent. And of course now with the energy transition shocks, which many of you are dealing with, which obviously is orders of magnitude but beyond anything that anyone imagined. All of these things are happening, but they've all been accelerated, of course, with the very recent energy crisis has really put a lot of these things into much greater focus, the sharpness of kind of the need for transitions. So we're kind of, you know, everybody's sprinting to try and catch up with a moving frontier, which is challenging at a speed that no one anticipated. And it brings us back to this point about shocks and resilience and the ability to reconfigure, reorganize, and so on. So it feels like the whole economy is in this context at the moment. That's exactly correct. it is. Manufacturing firms have been thinking about these things generally for longer than many services firms for precisely the reasons that you operate in. Your lead times tend to be much longer. You know, a lot of service firms, you can dip in and out of things, what we call contestable markets. The sunk costs, the upfront capital costs, often tend not to be so large in many service type industries. You can move in and out. In manufacturing and engineering, that's not normally the case because the capital cost, the physical capital, and the retraining required and upskilling required to engage with new technologies tend to have much longer lead times. So manufacturing and engineering has actually been in the vanguard of thinking about these issues precisely because the lead times tend to be longer. The rest of the economy is kind of playing catch up now. These are obviously big challenges for the levelling up agenda. I mean, this is the work obviously Jim O'Neill does. Why? Because those three shocks in terms of energy transitions, COVID and Brexit are more likely to severely affect the weak parts or the weaker regions economically of the UK. And there's a huge amount of data on these kinds of things. So where does that leave all that kind of subcentral devolution type agenda is you know, that's a difficult space at the moment, but we have to address this. We have to move forward in these things. And just a couple of key things to finish off with. The discussions around devolution, discussions around nearshoring, all these kind of potential changes. One of the areas that economists don't think about, that engineers think about all the time, is technology spaces. You know, economists often just kind of talk about technology as though it's kind of magic. It's something that just comes out of the sky. As long as you get the regulatory environment right, you get the legal principles right in terms of enforcement of contracts, somehow technology sort of magics itself up. It comes out of nowhere. I can see Chris is laughing over there. Precisely these kind of discussions, you hear this all the time in politics. Technology takes years to develop for precisely the things that people here are talking about. Long-term investments, upskilling, retraining, reconfiguration. These are things that don't just appear out of nowhere. They're things which are created and constructed over long, long periods. And equally, the ability to be resilient and reconfigure depends on the blueprints, the sets of templates you've already got. So for example, some of the discussions you hear about battery technologies, you know, we're going to do this, that, or the other, and I think, hang on a second, there's about 7 or 8 different battery technology trajectories, of which we have no presence in the UK, and about 5 of them, none at all. We've got a small number of key technologies where we're very good, but we've got lots of areas where we have no presence at all, and that would be true in many, many areas of manufacturing and engineering. That would be true for any country. You have specializations within specializations. So how you move forward in terms of your ability to reconfigure depends on the patents that you've got, depends on the technologies you've got, the templates you've got, and therefore you've got to think carefully about where you want to join things up to give yourself a chance to move forward. These things are not random. They're things which have to be also thought about and constructed purposefully. So resilience and responsiveness also requires strategy of how to move forward. Again, it's not something that economists tend to think about. They tend to think about that these things will kind of come out in the wash. But what we know from engineering is that's simply not true. Manufacturing and engineering require a lot of careful consideration of how different technologies and knowledge spaces embodied in those technologies, how do they come together? And how can they be built on and leveraged? And that's a big challenge, and that really reshapes how we have to think about these things. And that involves things like, you know, the role of angel investment, venture capital. You know, what kind of things are being funded, in what kind of places geographically, in what kind of technological spheres are these fundings going into, and how does that shape the configuration of our industrial fabric? These are really profound questions, and I think it's important in terms of economics that economists think a lot more about these questions. You know, engineers and technologists, people in the world that you're in, do think about these questions all the time, but it's not mainstream thinking in economics, and I think it would be very useful in terms of our policy discussions that we think in much more detail about these things. And then that brings us to the kind of things that Jim has already been referring to, the role of universities, knowledge spaces, how do you generate knowledge, how do you diffuse it, how do you share it, what kind of institutions do you need? You can start thinking about, look at the German case with things like the Fraunhofer institutions, all about knowledge generation, but knowledge diffusion, dissemination, connecting people, bringing people together, looking at technology spaces, how do we plug those gaps? these are things that I think we can give a lot more thought to. I think this research program absolutely will be addressing a lot of these issues. I think I'll stop there, okay? Thank you.
Thanks ever so much. So any questions for Phil?
Thank you for your presentation. My question has to do with resilience, especially with regards to the UK economy as a whole. If you look at the UK economy in terms of the recent shocks, back-to-back shocks from Brexit to COVID and now the energy transition problems, it seems that from GDP contraction data that is available, the UK economy seems to suffer much more disproportionate contraction when compared to other major economies. In terms of the Brexit, for example, UK seems to suffer more than continental Europe. In terms of COVID, also the same kind of pattern was repeated, and now we are also seeing the same kind of problem. Why do you think that is so? Is it that the UK economy is not so resilient in terms of industry and manufacturing and services?
Well, I think there's slightly different things going on here, but you see a similar pattern, but the rationale may be rather different. So in terms of the Brexit case, that's largely orders of magnitude. The UK is about between a fifth and a sixth of the size of the wider European economy. So of course, when you have a rupture in the trade relationships, the relative ordering, the magnitude is much greater on the smaller party. That was always going to be the case. And actually the amount of, there's a huge amount of data on these things now. So that's broadly the likely impact. Now, of course, these things have happened. It's in the past now. So it's a question of how do we move forward, exactly as Jim said, and how do we find ways to some extent overcome those challenges and find new ways to move forward. That is the challenge. Whatever people think about Brexit, that's the way, that has to be the challenge in terms of moving forward that all businesses have to address. So that, but in terms of the orders of magnitude, that's largely a scale-related problem. It's also somewhat to do with the structure as well of the different, of the UK economy vis-a-vis other parts of Europe. In terms of COVID, I think in the end what's happened is the effects of COVID on the UK economy are not that different to most other European countries. There are countries where the effects have been somewhat less, Germany, for example. But overall, some countries were hit much earlier. The UK was hit severely early. But over time, these things have tended to level out. So I'm just thinking about the kind of arguments you see in The Economist, for example. In the end, most places have tended, in terms of how they responded, the differences are not that great. What has been true is the point you made that the UK went in a much sharper contraction than many other countries and then came out at a faster rate. But actually where we've ended up has actually been somewhat weaker. I think sort of Financial Times type arguments on these things. So we haven't been in the strongest position. We've been somewhat weaker than other countries. So why that is, I think then you also have to get into arguments about healthcare provision and the structure of health services. It's not just about the nature of businesses. It's lots of other stuff which is also in there. In general, decentralized countries have done better. Not always, but in general in terms of healthcare responses and so on. So it's a broader socioeconomic discussion. In terms of the energy transition, this is to do with the structure of energy markets. Different countries generate and acquire energy through different systems, and the UK apparently seems to be rather significantly exposed. Everyone is, but again, just reading kind of things in the FT and The Economist, the UK is relatively exposed to these issues. So, but the point is that we've had three big shocks in very short succession to each other. And they've severely impacted on our economy. That's the situation we're in. I don't think there's any debate about that. Everyone knows that. The question is, how do we move forward? And I think a way of moving forward, which is much more about trying to think carefully about how our different skill sets and technologies and knowledge advantages relate to each other, how they connect, and how you also diffuse. This is Jim O'Neill's point about particularly the role of the universities as knowledge centres. How do you generate and diffuse those knowledge as much as possible around the country? And I think manufacturing is in a unique position here, because if you think about the way the economy works, service industries tend to be dominated by the city centres. That's how service industries tend to operate. They're very much city centre type economies. But manufacturing isn't like that. And a lot of the places in the UK that you really do want to level up and turn around are often out, not always, but they're often outside of those city areas. And manufacturing, the heterogeneity of manufacturing, the different technologies, the different knowledge spaces, different supply chains and so on, actually offers possibilities for a lot of these places which are not big central centres to actually start to turn around. That's one of the, I mean, in a sense, that's why this project is, one of the arguments why this project is so important, is precisely that, it potentially to look for opportunities for a wider array of places to start to turn themselves around. So I think that's part of the story here.
Yeah, thanks, Phil. And I think this is why it is quite interesting, because as a manufacturer or initially an engineer, then I can just use Make UK data. So when we looked at the Midlands and what happened during COVID, the West Midlands is more productive, but was substantially less resilient than the East Midlands. And that's partly because it was so dependent on aerospace and automotive, which turned off. So therefore, it's not just, and because we mainly do final assembly, it then turned off the rest of the supply chain, whereas the East Midlands, less productive, but more diverse, it actually had more inbuilt resilience. And I think going forward, I'm also seeing, though, now firms offshoring. So, you know, we talk about nearshoring, or I talk about right-shoring, but actually, in a way, a study we did in 2016, there's very few firms that actually make a conscious decision to bring something back. What they'll actually do is decide not to make something elsewhere. So it's like indirect reshoring. But actually what we're seeing is firms now, although we would think with circular economy drivers and the likes that we should be producing more in the UK, it's not happening because actually the cost of energy, the cost of labour and the cost of raw materials is actually significantly higher in the UK. So where firms have a choice to use a manufacturing asset that's not in the UK, they're shifting production volume elsewhere. And that's why we like to interact, because these debates, if I look at it from a global value network design perspective, from the perspective of a manufacturer, and Phil and Vanya look at it from an economic perspective, we push the debate forward. Yeah. And that's why we should all interact.
Exactly, thank you.
Thank you. So we want to keep us on time, and thank you to Phil and to Vanya.